All right, extraordinary women on boards, thank you so much for gathering today. We have an amazing session in store for us. I think that Valecia wanted to call it "Where There's Smoke, There May Be Fire." I think we ended up on how corporate board members detect signs of trouble. Both speak to a very important issue for board directors. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Valecia McDowell. She was introduced to me by our wonderful Ewob member, Susie Goldberger, who described her as an extraordinarily accomplished attorney. And she had me at the word extraordinary. So Valecia is with Moore&VanAllen, a law firm based in Charlotte. She is on the firm's management committee. She is co-head of the firm's white-collar regulatory defense and investigations practice, and she is a co-chair of Moore&VanAllen's diversity committee. She has extensive investigative experience and specific knowledge and experience in the areas of employee conduct risk and consumer finance investigations. She is a thought leader, as we will see momentarily. And Valecia, thank you so much for being here. And Susie, thank you so much as well.
So thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Susie. I'm so excited to be here. Very rarely do I get an opportunity to speak with a group of women that are as accomplished as this group of women. So I'm just happy to be amongst you and happy to give you some information from these 20 years of dealing with trouble.
Okay. So with that, please know that this group loves the topics of seeing around corners. They love to really dig into how we understand culture and risk. And I think are very curious as to how all of this has gotten more charged with a virtual world and less access to people and information. So let me start by saying, by asking you to maybe describe the work that you do. How did you get into this specialization? I'm sure there's not a typical day.
No, there's not. And that's really why I love this. I teach a course at my alma mater, Duke, around investigations. And I describe this work as sort of like being in a Scooby-Doo gang, but none of them know what I'm talking about because they're too young to know about Scooby-Doo. But every case is different because the dynamics on the executive teams are different. The board dynamics are different. The subjects are dramatically different. So, if I think about some of the work that I've done that's really representative of my work, my team's work, we have several dozen folks doing this work at Moore&VanAllen. I think my law partner, I think I saw Barbara Meeks join this call. She works with us very closely on the regulatory side because we do a lot of consumer finance, but that's not all we do. So in the finance space, our firm and my team particularly, we were the international global firm for LIBOR, for one of the large LIBOR players during the LIBOR inquiry. So you sort of think about that type of investigation, very data-driven inquiries across the US, all of North America, all of the EU, UK separately because obviously of the London nexus, all across Asia. So we were the point law firm on that over several years. So that's one type of investigation. Fraud investigations of all varieties over almost 20 years. So if you can think of a type of fraud that might have happened at a senior sort of operational level in a company or that would have significant regulatory impacts, we've dealt with that. I've dealt with that. So accounting fraud, healthcare fraud, mortgage fraud, general misrepresentations by executive management to the board leadership. That all sort of falls in that same bucket of investigations that we routinely handle. A lot of executive misconduct investigations. And so some of the ones you might think of, sexual misconduct, very common, where we get called in on an emergency basis. And again, we're talking about really C-suite level investigations, but also things like embezzlement, abuse of authority. Really common that we get called in because there's a question about abuse of authority that manifests itself in a lot of different ways. So that's sort of like the one-off type of executive misconduct or employee misconduct that we do. But increasingly, and this is new, right? This is a new phenomenon over the past 5 to 7 years. We're doing a lot of platform-wide or business unit-wide conduct management reviews. So some of those are, we're going to come in, this particular division or your operations in this particular country, there's a concern. Maybe there have been whistleblower allegations around that, or maybe a regulator has inquired as to whether or not your policies and practices are sufficiently robust. So we will come in, look at that top down, bottom up, give assessments, and stay with our clients to help them fix that, what we find. Barbara's integral in a lot of that work when we're doing it in the financial services space, but that is not specific to any industry. That is a huge trend in this area. That sort of dovetails with some of the DEI work that we do. A lot of public companies particularly are being asked to do DEI audits, ESG audits. We get called in to advise on that sort of work. And it's an overlay where I have particular experience and knowledge from a lot of the work that I've been doing sort of independent of my practice over years. So I find myself getting called on to assist companies. So it's soup to nuts. It's really a fascinating mix of work. What I like most about this job is really having the opportunity to solve problems. So we come in, lots of times people have no idea that this work is happening. Sometimes it's internally driven and not driven by a regulator, not driven by law enforcement. And we fix a lot of stuff. And so I go to sleep at night. I sleep pretty well because I know across a wide array of industries and companies, I've helped a lot of people. And I can't talk about the specifics of a lot of that, but this work is important in that way. So we're always looking for good partners that are interested in getting to the bottom of trouble and fixing it.
So that's fascinating. And I'm sure we could do a session on each one of those things. It's funny you say that you feel like you sleep well at night. What you just described was what keeps us up at night,
right.
All of those things. And so, I think you gave us a sense as to the types of things that you get called in for. Who typically calls you in? And specifically, how do you interact with boards? Maybe not all of the time, maybe some of the time, but that would be helpful to understand.
There are really two different models, right? So sometimes we get called in by a general counsel or a very senior person in a legal department. And then we are preparing materials that are provided to the board or to other governing bodies within that institution. But we're working directly with GC or some other very senior person within the legal department. Oftentimes we are engaged by the board directly. So it may be that the audit committee engages us, or a special litigation committee, or just a general special committee because of the investigation nature, where we are really reporting directly to the board. Sometimes the GC is a liaison, but sometimes the GC is not involved in the work, or there may be someone more junior within the legal department that is on point because the GC may be tangentially or directly involved in the issues. And so you don't want to have a potential fact witness be the point person. So we always have some sensitivity around that. But I would say, it's a good mix. In the fraud matters, it's overwhelmingly the board that engages us.
Wow, that's really interesting. I sort of am listening and hoping that that I never have the privilege. But if that were the case, it's great to know that you do what you do. So
it's a strange dynamic. No one wants to have to call us, right?
Right.
But what we want is at the end of that process for people to be grateful that we were the people that they called.
Absolutely.
And it's a tough dynamic because generally, this is not always the case, but frequently, we don't have a pre-existing relationship with the board or the GC because we're getting called in, under an emergency basis. And sometimes you absolutely want to use a law firm that doesn't routinely do work for that company.
Right.
Sometimes it's okay to go to your go-to firm. It really depends on the issue. So more often than not, where we're getting engaged by a board, the call of, will you come and do a pitch, is the first contact that we've had with that company or that board. And so, it's a fast trust building exercise, but it's important.
Yeah, I think, through a lot of our talks, we've come to realize that having these relationships and knowing people before you need to make that call is so important. So this is especially helpful. I see a couple of questions in the chat. So I just want to go to one in particular because I don't want to lose it in the direction that we're going. And that's Alicia's question. Would you ask it just about ESG, Alicia? Are you able to come on screen or ask it?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so the question was, well, first, thanks so much for this. This is so awesome. I'm really excited to hear the content. The question was really around the assurance of ESG data. And I guess my question was whether it's kind of going in on a general basis and saying, yep, everything looks okay, you have our seal of approval, or whether it's because there are people challenging it and saying, we don't believe this is true, or this is greenwashing. And you're being brought in because there are potential legal issues around that data. So it was really more of a clarification of the work that you've done in terms of ESG assurance. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. So it's a little bit of all of the above, right? So frequently the company may do its own ESG review and say, are there areas or things that you would have considered that we have not covered here, or the questions or people, essentially, here's our process. This is how we got to this output. Can you advise us to make the ultimate work product more defensible? Particularly, this is more in the DEI space, but these are really parallel observations. Sometimes we just get called in to do the work because the shareholder demand is articulated in a way where it's clear that there's not the degree of trust in the institution, and having an independent third party perform the work provides some additional assurance to the shareholder or whomever is giving rise to the need to do the audit. So we've done them ourselves. We're in the middle of getting ready to start one now that is going to cover some ESG concerns, but also DEI concerns. So we're going to do it soup to nuts, but frequently we're called in to say, this is the process we engaged in. What else would you advise that we consider, or what is your reaction? Where that's a privileged conversation. Ultimately the audit material is public and will be public, but that privileged conversation helps them get to a product that the market is going to feel better about.
So I know ESG is so top of mind. I figured you said that, and I know it caught people's attention. So I just wanted to make sure people knew that was a thing. But let's jump into some of the questions that we had planned, and then I see that there are already some lining up in the chat, so we'll get to those for sure. So when
I'm going to come back. So if we don't get through all this, if you guys
awesome, you're an honorary friend of Ewob now. So when we prepared for this session, you told me about what you call the 3 C's. Care, curiosity, and caution. And in the context of board dynamics, which is something that this group thinks a lot about, why don't we dive into each one? So maybe you want to start with care. What falls into this category?
Sure. So one of the things that I've observed, my partners have observed over years, is because board members, especially now, right, board members are recruited for very specific expertise. So you may have deep understanding of IT, for example. And so they bring you in and you're kind of the IT board member. And one of the concerns is people have a tendency to want to stay in their silo or stay in their lane on boards. So they'll say, well, I'm IT. I don't really know that much about executive comp. So I'll defer to people who had more direct experience about executive comp. That kind of deference is what I'm really trying to get people to at least challenge for themselves, because you are not the IT fiduciary, right? You are the fiduciary of the company. Your responsibilities go beyond that particular part of your history that brings you to the board, but you bring your whole self to the board. So caring about issues that are outside of your area of expertise and understanding them well enough to be able to discharge your duties as a board member, that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about caring. And so there's part of that involves your personal level of engagement, and there's part of that challenges the tendency to defer.
That is really interesting, because In your experience, have you found that boards really talk about their own dynamics and understand how they want to play as a bunch of individually skilled people acting as a team? Because I see a lot of that, that deference, and it gets in the way of asking smart questions sometimes.
No. So in my experience, I do not see a lot of intentionality around observing existing board dynamics and changing them, and having some agreement about what the culture of the board will be. I don't see that. I would encourage everybody on this call, to the extent that you can, on your individual boards, try to introduce those ideas. I think we see that in the corporate community at the management level with a lot more intentionality and consulting support, but we just haven't gotten there yet consistently with boards.
Yeah, I think that's a big opportunity, especially reflecting on the pandemic and especially being virtual. But often questions don't get asked because someone assumes that the expert board member in the room should ask it, and when they don't, then an opportunity is missed.
And the other piece of that is the individuals who have so-called across the frame executive experience take on an outsized role, and they have an outsized voice. And that's not always the healthiest dynamic. So really talking through that with some intentionality, even if you have to do it with a smaller number of board members, and just start to build some agreement about where you want that board to go, that's one way to deal with it. But
let's talk about curiosity. Oops, sorry.
Other things, yeah. So curiosity, and this is going to be probably embedded in a lot of the topics that we talk about here today, Lisa. But to put it really frankly, if you are relying just on the materials that your executive team gives you, that is a fundamentally incurious practice, right? If you're being just spoon-fed and there's no opportunity to get information outside of those decks, you're likely not getting all the information you need. Now, that doesn't mean that there's fraud happening because you're just getting information from the deck, but you're much more likely to find yourself on the wrong side of a good faith mistake if you aren't really engaging with management outside of those discussions, posing questions, leaving room for questions in your board meetings and the like. So curiosity is, a key factor in discharging this duty.
I think one thing that I've heard is an issue as people, move meetings that usually take place in person to Zoom, even after a year of it, is that there isn't time left for questions. And you just try to get through the agenda because everyone's sitting on too many Zooms. And it's important that, we all make sure that there's time for questions, and not just, hey, any questions, and then move on to the next thing without really listening, but like plan in the agenda time for questions, or else there's no opportunity.
I mean, even if you plan for questions, you're likely going to eat into that time. But if you're not doing it, you can forget about having a real dialogue. What you'll get will be 2 or 3 questions from the people who always ask questions. And so that's not the same thing as having a dialogue or, real collaboration around solving a problem or getting to, a new strategic vision for the company. Because that's really, you're playing in that strategic space, which is should be a fundamentally collaborative exercise. And so if all of your meetings are being designed in a way that doesn't afford that, that's a flag.
Right.
And you want to talk to your board chair about that. And you want to talk to your fellow board members about just a restructuring of how you're using that time.
And let's talk about caution, your third C.
So caution, I always say caution as opposed to skepticism or suspicion, right? People are very nervous about upsetting the apple cart with their executive team members. Board members are always rightly sensitive to supporting the executive leadership and not getting into a us versus them dynamic. That is all wise, but it is your responsibility to make sure that you're getting to the right decisions. So sort of joining hands with them and saying, hey, listen, thank you for this information. I have a couple additional questions because I don't quite understand this. Can you give me, this is what I need for us to be able to move forward and carefully deliberate what you are proposing. That's a totally different tone than, I need this, you didn't give me this, I don't trust Bob because, you know, he did X, Y, or Z. It puts you on different footing, but it helps to get you to the same place. So that's, I frame it as caution. Sometimes I frame it as carefulness. But again, these are just things that are inherent in the duty.
And I think you also have some really good habits in terms of getting information for board directors that you should share.
Yes, and Susie will laugh because I'm sure she's heard some of this, but it's always a good practice to make sure that you're building relationships. I'm sure you've heard this, below the executives that you normally see in the board context. Much easier to do, obviously, in a non-COVID environment, but still doable. Some of the boards that do it most successfully have board buddies, for example. So each board member might have 2 or 3 leadership team members. So someone from the C-suite, maybe 1 or 2 operational leaders that they are in regular contact with. And so, basically like a mentor-mentee relationship. One of the real advantages to having those one-off conversations is you're going to get a lot of questions answered and not use your main board time to get to those questions. And there's a lot that you can get to that's under the hood in those conversations that you wouldn't be able to get to in regular board time. So I always encourage people to ask questions like, what was the last thing that got cut from the deck of materials before this meeting? And why did it get cut? And, or, what was the thing you guys debated the most when you were preparing the board materials this go around? That'll give you some indication of where the stress is at the management team. If there's no stress in the management team, that's shocking, right? Like, these are folks with competing interests and competing needs and representing different aspects of the company. That's healthy. Typically what happens is your CEO is going to show up and everything's going to be rosy, and what's in the deck is the gospel truth. It's not, right? It is a version of the current state of events. And so having those other relationships and asking those types of questions will help you to understand that much better. And then bring that knowledge with you to the board meeting, as opposed to asking the CEO in that setting, which can be, again, can drive that us versus them dynamic.
Sure. That's great advice. And I love the concept of board buddies. It just makes it so much easier. I think
I'm so smart.
Sorry.
So the hyper targeting really
Sorry.
allows.
Okay, I think I found it. Sorry about that. So I think that one warning sign, tell me if you agree, is when the management doesn't allow the board access below, the senior executive level.
Huge warning sign. And that happens, all right? There are circumstances where you have to oust your CEO. That happens. I mean, I've certainly been involved in multiple investigations recently where that has been sort of the decision point, and ultimately we've had to do that. And if you have not developed those relationships with other folks, you have a major crisis on your hands at that point in time. And so if your CEO has basically held those people at bay, or given them 3-minute speaking parts in your board session where they present the talking points that the CEO has blessed, as opposed to giving you an opportunity to have a real dialogue with them, you should be concerned about that dynamic.
What other warning signs do you see between management and the board that you might want to highlight? Yeah,
well, that's a big one. If there's resistance to going around the deck and having real dialogue, I view that as a significant warning sign. I mean, we could go into specific subjects because there are warning signs about each of those specific subjects. But if I'm thinking about dynamics that almost always fail, right? You have dictatorial leadership by 1 or 2 board members, and everyone else is sort of quiet and you're not getting the information. That is a universal fail. That happens all the time. If you have a board that has a tendency to sort of normalize decisions that are problematic, boards are like any other groups, like group dynamics. I was a psych major, which is probably part of how I ended up in this practice. But I've seen in a lot of my fraud investigations, particularly scenarios where the board had questions or had concerns about the practices that we ultimately determined to be fraudulent or otherwise significantly problematic from an operational perspective. And they nibbled at the edges of those concerns, or a new board member would come on, and this is like the 8th time somebody's talked about this practice, and everybody else is completely desensitized to it because it has become normal for that board presentation. Oh, well, we have to do it this way because there's the industry's different, or, oh yeah, we had somebody look at this, accounting treatment before like 8 board meetings ago. So don't worry about it. This is what we're doing. If you find yourself sitting in a board meeting where you're like, that doesn't make any sense to me. You're new to the board. You're getting presented with a new issue, but everybody's sort of Jedi mind tricking you about that. These are not the droids you're looking for. Stop. Right? You don't have to do it in the meeting, right? So you can express a concern and say, I don't want to take up a bunch of time in the meeting, but I would like to have some one-on-one time where we walk through this. And anyone else who might be interested in participating, please join me. But can we calendar some time so that I can get a better understanding of this issue? Because invariably we come in, we do an investigation, we come back and say, hey, look, this has been going on, shouldn't been going on. You're getting, you're going to have to unwind these practices, pay back huge amounts of money, talk to the federal government. This is going to be a mess. People are left on the board kicking themselves because they just had a bad feeling about it to begin with, and they didn't act on it. They sort of went along. It's like a go along, get along situation. You don't have to be obstructionist to get to a place where you understand and are comfortable with issues that are being presented to you. And then, like I said, under specific topics, there are all sorts of, signs of warning. But as a general proposition, if you find yourself normalizing something that doesn't make sense, then stop.
So let's talk about style for a moment. There's a question I'll ask on Joan's behalf. How to deal with a GC who wants to be too involved versus a board that wants to work independently. How do people deal with that?
So one way to deal with it is if you have placed that matter in a special committee, at which point the special committee is going to be directing the work. And we've had circumstances where that board member, that board committee has instructed the GC to give another human being and walled them off, or said, we want your involvement to be minimal. We want to work directly with outside counsel. We want a fresh look at this. And we've done that in circumstances where there was no immediate indication that the GC was in any way complicit in potential misconduct. It doesn't have to be that. But if you think about a C-suite, you literally have 5 to 6 people who are together all the time, and the GC is one of them. And so if you really need an independent investigation frequently, you will want to work directly with outside counsel, and that's your prerogative, right? Sometimes I think boards forget what you are allowed to do. That's your prerogative. You can say, we have an audit committee, we have an independent committee, we want direct contact, and then let the audit committee chair decide the extent to which the GC is involved. Frequently they're involved at the beginning and then involved at the end, and not so much in the middle. They may be involved for the purposes of helping to gather information, but not to direct strategy.
So, style plays such a big role in things. I'm going to turn to Jerry for her question.
Hi. Yeah, this is just one of those, and it becomes kind of a judgment call. I'm kind of interested in your advice on how to deal with these situations. And, I'm on both public and private boards, and I've seen it happen a number of times, not just any one. And that is, the management style of the CEO and how that impacts, obviously, the work environment. And, there are some styles that are more aggressive, right? You hear about the screamers,
Yes.
right? At what point does it cross the line where the board, because it's about culture, it's about hostile work environment, Especially if you know that at least makes one, if not more than one of the direct reports CEO uncomfortable, and comfortable can be defined a lot of ways, I suppose.
I've had multiple investigations that were only about that issue, Jerry. Where it crosses the line is when it it crosses the line when you've got actionable behavior, period, full stop. So like if you've got a person in your CEO role who's essentially harassing someone under the legal definition of harassment, you got to deal with all of that. But that's not the question you're asking. You're saying from a management perspective, when is that person's dictatorial or bullying nature too much for the business? And to answer that question, it is when the direct reports of the CEO and their direct reports no longer feel comfortable raising issues to the CEO that you need to know about because of the culture that is being cultivated at the company. And I have been brought in multiple times just to get to the bottom of that issue, where somebody has called an ethics line and said, this CEO, not the CEO is cooking the books, but there are things you need to know or things that we think are important that he won't let you hear about because he's got a particular view and is hiding information, not so much misrepresenting in a fraudulent way, but hiding information from the board. That happens. We come in, we will usually conduct a covert investigation or, unless these circumstances will allow us to do it openly. But sometimes we'll just do that covertly. We will interview all of the employees below that. We will monitor communications after we've left to see if there are communications to indicate that there was pressure around that, whether or not the directs were reporting back to the CEO. Then we start to plant questions, right? So we'll plant questions with those board buddies and see if any of that information that you're concerned about makes its way up to the board. The CEO can be your best friend or the person that puts the clog in the pipe. And you'll never know whether there's a clog unless you're talking to these other people routinely. And if you've got a person in that CEO role that is not collaborative, but is really more bullying in nature, your risk of that dynamic goes up exponentially. I've just seen it a lot. And we've had to fire CEOs over that. Like we've had boards that said, once that was transparent to them, once they understood those dynamics, they just had to step in and act. And in some of those circumstances, again, there's no accounting fraud or, there's not that was not the issue. The issue was, what was the net impact of how this person relates to the other leaders in the company, and how is that prohibiting our ability to discharge our duty as board members?
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think related to that is just the topic of culture in general. And in this group, we've spent a lot of time just trying to understand, as board directors in the seats that we sit, how do we really know what's going on? How do you know if there's a bad culture, a good culture? What should we be looking at or looking for? Do you have some good advice or warning signs as to how to think about that?
Yeah, so a lot of it we're talking about here, right? A lot of it is around how much transparency you have, how controlled the messaging is that's coming to you. In terms of board culture, how cliquish your board is. That's a real dynamic that deserves most boards and deserves a lot of women who are serving on boards, because there's an in crowd and an out crowd with that. Some boards, I think we may have covered this, but some boards are too collegial. Around, I think we talked about this a little bit, but looking at those cultural dynamics.
I'm talking more about the culture of the company.
Oh, well, look, the culture of the company is a different, that's a different issue. So the culture of the company is something you can study as an academic exercise, and that you can get your arms around. There are great consultants out there that do that work. And Dennison, Gartner, others that will come in and do a company-wide cultural review for you your companies are probably already doing surveying. That's a place where if you're getting those presentations and you're not getting an opportunity to dig behind the data, you really, really want to do that. You can bring in firms. We do this all the time where we go behind that data. We do interviews of our own to try to figure out how reliable the information is, how reliable the characterization of that data is by management to the board. So you might be getting data, for example, about the number of employee complaints that are coming in, or discrimination complaints, or whistleblower complaints. But that's always going to be coming to you in a package. It's always going to be coming to you, this is our explanation, or yes, of course, we have more of these because of this particular thing about our industry, or this particular thing about our development, or we acquired companies, and so we've got growing pains. We can come in, and we do this, and interview folks to try to figure out if those explanations hold up. I've got a company that we've worked with in the recent past where they've explained a lot of the cultural findings that they've seen. They base it on the locations of the different operational facilities. And they said, well, these are the cultures of the places, not the culture of the company. We have the capacity to go in and test that theory and come. And it's not super expensive to do that. You don't have to talk to that many people. You just are very intentional about what you ask, you talk to, how you stage that, so we can get to the bottom of that. But there are some definite, and I even made a little list for you because I knew you were going to ask about culture. There are some definite warning signs that you may have a cultural problem at your company. So if you see a bunch of whistleblower complaints and you haven't before, start to see a spike in that, even if they appear to be different types, different issues, what you're really hearing is something's wrong with the communication up through the management chain. So be aware of that. If you kind of have completely different companies across business units, so this product line, they're super aggressive, or they have a very different risk appetite than the rest of the company, you can have a cultural issue there. Turnover that is sort of outside of the standard deviation of your industry norms, your management is going to explain that away, but that is a red flag. Stop and try to get to the bottom of why that's happening. If these complaints that are coming in are not being substantiated at a rate that is consistent with sort of industry norms, again, there's a lot of public data out there about this. Consultants have a lot of data about peer firms, so you can say, okay, well, just as a rule of thumb, generally, employee complaints are substantiated around 20%, 20 to 40%, depending on the industry, depending on the type of complaint. If you are grossly below that and have been for years, you have a cultural problem, right? Data can drive this. So as a board member, that's the sort of information you want to obtain from management, and they may not volunteer it for you. So you want to sort of be thinking about a constant list of what are the topics, what are the things that I'm going to want to get from folks, and when's the best opportunity to get that, what's the best committee for this information to flow through, so you're not creating double duty, and making sure that you're getting sort of the underlying materials that other committees are grappling with as well, if those are issues where you have unanswered questions. But if you got weak control functions, is another issue. If you're underfunding your HR, audit, compliance, that's a big red flag. Folks say, well, we want to spend the money here. We don't need these functions. HR particularly, if you're in an unregulated environment, if you have a weak HR function, that frequently goes hand in glove with a cultural problem in a company.
So I'm going to turn to Leah for her question. Leah, don't feel compelled to come on screen, but your question seems to be a great fit right now.
Great, thank you, and love this talk. Thank you for doing it today. So my question has to do with looking at the organizational constructs, and if there are any red flags around that you would notice being in an investigatory situation. So the specific example that I'm thinking of is a company where they had multiple organizations that were reporting up to the same senior leader who worked for the leader, for the CEO, specifically the general counsel, the HR, and the communications functions. And there were some very small complaints that were coming through, but we didn't have an opportunity to get to look at a lot of those around potential cover-up kind of situations in that circumstance. That's just one example, but are there certain types of organizational constructs you would say these should be looked at, or we would recommend that we have separation of duties in these situations?
Sure. So the dynamic you're describing around, the GC and sort of the reporting in, that's very difficult to get a view to other than through direct relationships by board members with those team members. But if you are getting complaints, that's a different issue, right? So you mentioned that complaints, maybe they were minor complaints, really running those to ground and having some feedback loop on those back to the board would be critical, right? So if there's a complaint about your GC, obviously that has got to go out of normal, sort of your normal process for complaints. It should really go directly to the audit committee. And the audit committee should take that quite seriously. I mean, your GC is really the ethical part of most companies. Most companies don't have a chief ethics officer. The GC really plays that role. So I would encourage that. In terms of organizational structures or other red flags, one that comes to mind, because I've seen it so frequently, is informality around employee complaints and failure to aggregate complaint data in a way to allow you to predict when you have a problem. So, and this is much more common than people realize. If you've got informal complaints where operational lead is bullying or operational lead is not working collaboratively, is not accepting credible challenge, those sorts of complaints, but they're not going through a more formal mechanism and they're being handled within that business unit. So when you ask, have there been complaints about X, and you can't get an answer, that's a red flag. That happens a lot because a lot of companies really want to encourage informal complaint processes so it can be handled by that business leader and it doesn't sort of blow up and become a thing. You can handle it the exact same way, but you have to treat it like a formal complaint and paper it and aggregate the data around those things so you can begin to see, oh, this person from job to job, from unit to unit has had these types of issues. And when they have, this has been the operational consequence of that activity. Lots of companies just are not doing that.
I think just as a follow-on, are there any reporting structures themselves that are problematic? Like should so-and-so not report to the CEO or things like that?
Sure. So, I mean, the example that was just given, I think you said it was Leah who asked the question. Any scenario where your head of compliance, head of audit, these individuals you're getting complaints about them, the board needs to know about that. Because even if ultimately the CEO reaches some determination that this is not a concern to that, to that CEO, you may have a different view of that. And so if you have a reporting structure where you don't have visibility to those types of concerns, that's problematic.
And I think related to that, Maura, maybe you want to ask your question since it also relates to how an organization is structured.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I actually think we've covered a bit of it. I was just looking to go a little deeper on understanding, that really important role of the head of compliance, integrity, however you want to describe that role. And just how do you think about trying to get the most out of that group? Because I think we traditionally have learned to rely pretty heavily on the reporting, right? We've got input into the reporting. So this conversation about additional things to ask for has been helpful. But are you seeing anything else, or can you recommend anything else that would really help us understand what good looks like in that context?
In terms
Because
of in terms of the reporting from compliance, for example, or
not just the reporting, but maybe it goes to even the relationship or the skills and capabilities in that role, because accepting that we've all got to worry about the 3 C's, like
right.
there's still some reliance that needs to be placed on that internal function. How do we make sure we get that right, even beyond the reporting?
Yeah. So again, this goes back to that would be a role that I would expect someone on the board or multiple people on the board to have direct relationships with that individual. I don't know if most of your companies are doing 360 feedback. But Maura, that's another, and that when we come in and we are doing this conduct management reviews, the platform-wide reviews, we look at all of that feedback. So you would get sort of that lateral view from the peers of your head of compliance about their strengths and weaknesses, and that would give you more information about whether or not you're needing to plug holes in terms of that person's capabilities or tendencies, right? It might not even be capabilities. They may have, a propensity to focus on a particular set of issues to the exclusion of other issues. There has to be some opportunity for that information to get to you. And if you have that opportunity sort of regularized, and that takes the temperature down, so you're not just like, so tell me what's wrong with Jill, the head of compliance. That's the dynamic you don't want to be in. But if that's always happening, and those key leadership individuals are providing that 360 feedback, and that 360 feedback is getting aggregated and provided to you by someone other than your CEO, right? So that could be outside counsel, that could be, it could be going directly to audit, but someone other than someone who has a vested interest in how that is characterized, that'll give you a lot of data. And companies have had a tremendous amount of success with that.
Maybe we should dive into some of the other categories, like, things related to earnings and forecasts and sales and expenses.
Yeah, so Lisa had asked me to think about other signs of trouble in these areas. And so on the earnings front, there are some things that just come up over and over again. So if you see business unit growing earnings way faster than the rest of the company, that could be great. You might just have hit on a success. Just pay closer attention. A lot of the things I'm getting ready to go through doesn't mean that you have a problem. It does mean that you should pay heightened attention to the facts around it when you're getting that information. By contrast, if you've got eerily consistent earnings, quarter after quarter, year after year, that sort of belies common sense, right? How is that happening? Are these earnings being manipulated to get you to what has been deemed to be an acceptable level? So keep your eyes out for that. Relying on complex accounting rules and sort of rushing through the explanation of those complex accounting rules is a red flag. So always sort of unpacking that and having someone, again, doesn't have to be in the primary board meeting, but having someone give you a sufficient amount of information so that you can reach your own determination as to your level of comfort about that. That's important. In a lot of earnings cases, the accounting assumptions change often, right? So if suddenly you've had a particular accounting treatment for 3 quarters, and that accounting treatment would otherwise yield a less than advantageous outcome, so you've suddenly determined that you need to change the treatment, again, doesn't mean it's wrong, just means stop and pay attention to that and really probe. These are, again, sort of the caution moments in an earnings context. Anything that's just hard to understand, or even if you just got business units that are under significant earnings pressure, look more closely at the data you're getting around earnings from those units, because it's just, temptation is there, right? And it's very easy for folks to say, well, these are close calls, and we could go this way or we could go this way, but if we go this way, we're going to get to the number that we're supposed to be getting to. Even good people will make bad choices in those circumstances. So those are in the earnings space, those are some of the signs of trouble. So if we had had a time machine for a lot of my clients, they would have had some discomfort around those issues, but didn't pursue that. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the normalization of certain things. Forecasts is another sort of area where you want to be vigilant. If you see changes in forecast, up or down, without sort of an obvious or understandable rationale, you're going to want to inquire around that. A lot of cases around that. Forecasting growth that is significantly above the industry markers or significantly above the sector markers. This happens a lot of the time, and people, I think, start to misunderstand the difference between puffing or optimism and what should happen in a forecast. It's the board's responsibility to really dig into that to see if you are comfortable with that forecast, as you know, people are going to be relying on it. So really digging into that. If you're seeing assumptions for the forecast that are not intuitive, that contradict the experience of the industry, that contradict past experience of the company, you're going to want to, again, probe around this, be cautious around that. Doesn't mean it is a problem, but it is something to look at. Sales and expenses, taken at different times. If suddenly you're seeing a disconnect between significant sales and expenses and when they're being accounted for, it's worth asking the question for all the reasons that we just talked about around earnings. Again, similarly, if suddenly there's a change in assumptions around the reflection of sales and expenses, same sort of issue. And then there was one here, Lisa, that we talked about, and I think this group is particularly interested in, which is around compensation.
Yes.
Right. This comes across industries, across geographies. Direct drive compensation. It's not terrible. Just look at it. So if you've got people, senior people particularly, who are getting paid on commission, or they have incentive compensation arrangements that are disconnected from the overall performance of the company, but are rather sales driven, or have very specific targets. We've seen this across a lot of industries, probably most prominently in the financial services industry. I'm not picking on Wells Fargo, is a client of mine, and I adore them. I think Barbara's on here. But it's a very clear example, right, where you saw at the low level and at more senior levels, a lot of compensation being driven based on sales targets. You can do it, but you want to make sure that you're not creating a culture that is going to generate risk, that the sales targets are achievable based on forecasts that are explainable. There's a lot of risk in that kind of a compensation model. And so you just want to be vigilant about that. Any kind of compensation systems that call for goals that are outside of what you would expect to see in the industry. So if you're looking at your peers and they're projecting very different sales goals or very different incentive or markers than what you are setting your compensation for, you want to be aware of that as well. And one of the things that I've seen at least twice in the past 5 years that really was not on my radar screen before I saw it is differentials in compensation between tiers of leadership in a way that might be self-serving. So management comes to you, CEO comes to you and says, we're going to have this management tier for the executives, we're going to have this management tier for the 2 downs, we're going to have this management tier for operational leadership. And the goals for operational leadership are not attainable, right? They are based on a very aggressive forecast. And you see differentials between the goals for these different groups, not just, differences in what they will net. That's completely normal, but differences in the actual markers. That is also a potential problem. That hasn't been as common, but it's probably worth raising in the compensation space. Any thoughts or questions? Let me check the chat. Anything?
Yeah,
on
I
any of-
think I was going to call on Shaz, who has a question related to financial reporting and such. Shaz, are you able to unmute? Oh, sorry, she had to just drop. Let me ask her question. Sorry. Apologies for that. Her question was, what recourse does a board director have if a CEO is expected of either falsifying financial information with the support of his or her, I guess, CFO, or not sharing it with the board even when asked?
What options? Is that the
What recourse does a board director have?
So in that scenario, again, the board has every recourse, right? So the audit committee chair or you can accept either the audit committee, or you can establish a special investigation committee to come in, look at the circumstances around that scenario. Ultimately, if you conclude that that is indeed what happened, you need to get rid of those two executives. That's squarely on the board, right? So the recourse is to conduct an investigation to confirm that understanding is accurate, as opposed to I have a hunch this is happening, or I've heard this is happening. You know, really get to the bottom so you have something that is reliable and verifiable in terms of a finding. But once you have that finding, it's incumbent upon that board member and the board as a collective to change those individuals out. And there will likely be lots of debates around their compensation and whether they're being removed for cause or not for cause. And you go through all of those hurdles, but they have to go in that scenario.
Thank you. So I know you had some great code language you wanted to share, which if we hear it, we should just go and then if you don't mind sharing, and then I'll jump back into the questions from the chat.
Sure. So these are all reasonably innocuous statements. So let me just preface by saying that, but they point to potential problems. So, and I've heard them a lot. Our culture would not allow fraud. Our culture at the top is so strong. I can't even conceive that this would happen, where people are just, guys, I know I live and breathe this, but fraud happens all the time. People make honest mistakes all the time. People make dishonest mistakes all the time. It's surprisingly common for people to lead a company down a path that the board would otherwise not have wanted. So that kind of couldn't happen here. Not this good place where, you know, I like everybody. Just don't even say it. Don't even be thinking about that. Everybody thought that before they ended up having a fraud in their companies. This team is so smart. I mean, I would dive into this, but they're just so talented. Good. Let them use that talent to help you have a better understanding of the issue. That doesn't mean, again, that you should defer to them. I've heard CEOs in board meetings say over and over again, just trust me, fill in the blank. It's not your job to trust the CEO. It's your job to trust your own judgment, right? At the end of the day, it's the board's collective judgment that you will be judged on. And so getting information from the CEO, critically important. Asking for the additional information that you need, critically important. But trusting without follow-up that you feel that you need is insufficient. We've always done it this way. This happens, this one I hear a lot. So like new board members will come onto the board and they're like scratching their heads, like, why would we ever, you know, why would we ever have this business practice? Why would we ever use this accounting treatment? I don't understand. Well, I mean, we've done it as long as I've been on the board. You know, Susie, how long have you been doing it? How long have you been on the board longer? And everybody's like, oh, well, we've always done it this way. And that's it, right? No, 2-second time out. Even if it's legal, right? We've always done it this way isn't really, it's not a helpful response, right? If you're raising the question because you have a concern about how it's being done, satisfy yourself about that concern. Again, doesn't have to happen in that meeting, but find a time, find a mechanism for doing that. The team will leave if we push on this. This one's really common, especially when companies are under stress. Oh my God, they're dealing with so much. If we ask them to do one more thing, and I just think we're going to lose CEO, we're going to lose CFO if we ask him to take the time out of his busy schedule to explain this accounting treatment to us. That's not an adequate response. It may be true that your team is incredibly stressed, and you may be able to get the information in a way that puts less stress on the team. And to the extent that you can find ways to mitigate the impact on a team under stress, by all means do that. But if you have a question you need to get answered or an issue you need to get to the bottom of, and the pushback is, if you're asking this question, your key leadership member is going to walk from the company, that's a that's a flag that you want to pay attention to. And it's surprisingly common. Customers, clients, they just don't get it. So whatever the issue is, we understand it, but regulators, customers, clients, they just don't get what we're dealing with. Well, ask yourself, well, do I get it? Right? Like, am I tracking? Is this intuitive to me? Is this explanation plausible to me? This is part of this in crowd, out crowd, click dynamic that we talked about earlier in the board. That happens a lot with existing board members saying that to new board members. And so, hear it, that's fine, but keep pushing in whatever setting is most appropriate. This happens more in certain regulated lines of business, but we'll hear, audit, compliance, legal, they're to blame for these issues because they're characterizing it that basically they're short selling the business is fine, but they're overly sensitive, or some version of blame the messenger. The business is doing its best. Again, could be true, but have direct communications with those control group leaders to try to understand why they are framing their comments and their reports to you in the way that they are, so that you can have an independent judgment as to whether or not they've gone too far, or whether or not the data that you're receiving from them directly gives rise to a concern you want to explore. So that's some of it. This time it's different is probably one of my favorites too. It's happens all the time, and that's pretty self-explanatory. So those are just a few of them. At this point, I hear them, and it's just like a bell going off in my ear as outside counsel, because I'm in the unique position to be popping from board to board, and I'm always there in a time of stress. And so for the people who are saying those things, they aren't usually having to say those things, right? Because they're not normally under stress, but those are some of the classics.
Well, I'll just chime in because I had a strange stint in my career where for 4.5 years, I was in the chief operating officer role for compliance, legal, and audit. And when I was new in that role, there would be things explained to me. And the answer was, well, we've always done it this way. And again, nothing was wrong. It just was, wait a second. And so I would find that it usually took 3 to 5 whys. Well, why? And why? And why? And why? And not in an antagonizing way, just a very curious way. And then you get to some really interesting answers. And it may be perfectly reasonable to continue
Absolutely.
doing it that way. But unless you question it, sometimes people have been trained by people who didn't really explain it and just said, well, we've always done it this way. And they've accepted that answer. And sometimes you get to a situation where you're like, well, wait a second. Does this method of doing things, even though we've done it for 10 years, still make sense? And
Look,
so
more often than not, when you go behind that, it's going to be completely innocuous.
Yeah.
But the issue is you want to have a discipline, a personal discipline as a board member of making sure you get to that resolution, so that you don't get to a scenario where you're like kicking yourself. I wish I'd asked those questions.
So let me go to all the questions in the chat. I'll get to everyone. Catherine Honig, I'll go to you first.
Hold on. Thanks, Lisa. This has been really interesting. I've heard so many of those stories before that it's nice to hear someone else confirm that my antenna were rightly up. So anyway, I've been on both sides of internal investigations, both as a general counsel and as a board member. In each instance, I'm very curious on your take on the requirement that you make disclosures around those investigations. And when is the right time? And when are you know enough to say something? And when are you potentially, you potentially damage someone who may prove to have done nothing wrong, or you put the company in peril? So I'd be very interested if you could spend a little time talking about that. And in particular, when should the board be concerned when disclosures aren't being made?
All right. So I always have the practice of working very closely with our governance team around that. Particularly in the public company context, to ensure that the company is covered. And we usually do that in conjunction with the audit committee chair and or the special investigation committee chair. It all turns on level of certainty, right? So there are some circumstances where the board, because of the magnitude of the issue or the nature of the issue, may choose to indicate that that there's been an inquiry, right? So if you've received a subpoena, if there is a fact that should otherwise be disclosed, that will dictate whether or not you have a disclosure at the outset. But a lot of what we're talking about are things that are internal investigations, internal reviews. And so until you have you get closer to some set of conclusions, certainty, typically there's not a disclosure about that. But by contrast, if you are subject to a federal subpoena or an international request for information or things of that nature, then you'll see disclosures around that. Those decisions are all, this isn't a super helpful answer, but it's true. They're all case by case analyses. And so we have a tendency to sit down, look at what the facts are that are surrounding that investigation, pull the germane case law with our governance team to determine in advance. We don't think that we need to disclose now, but if we get to these outcomes, then we're going to need to make a disclosure. And so everybody knows that this is sort of part of our as outside counsel, our transparency to the board, right? That's one of the regular waypoints that we try to communicate as we're going through the investigation. So essentially every report out we have will include the question, do we need to make a public report now? What are the circumstances when we're going to need to do that? Have they changed in any way since the last time we convened this group?
And how, did you mind me just asking how you're including the chair of audit or the special committee involved or the chair of governance? And how often do you typically end up reporting to them? And how often should a board member expect to hear from you?
So Susie obviously has worked with me, and she was an audit chair. I think she mentioned this in her comments. I try to be essentially joined at the hip with whoever is in charge from a board perspective, audit committee, special committee, what have you, all the way through the process. Because number one, it provides comfort, it builds trust. We can't be in a position to share findings, right? Everybody always is like, well, what are you finding? That's the key question. And so to sort of allay that concern, allay that sort of desire, we're always sharing about process as we're going along. And when we get to a waypoint where we can share preliminary observations, for example, which would not be findings, we do that, and we do it in real time. So depending on the speed of the investigation, the nature of the investigation, we might be in communication with that representative and potentially other board members on a daily basis. I mean, if we're moving fast, then we're going to talk every day. And I'm going to give you a factual download every day so that that person is sort of going along in the process and seeing how the information is evolving. That's different than the full board, right? So the full board would not necessarily expect that level of contact. Even the full audit committee isn't going to be getting information typically in real time in that way. But very, very frequent communication, principally about process, And then again, at waypoints around high-level observations. Ultimately, then you get to preliminary observations or preliminary findings, and then findings. And then we always have a conversation with that director about how we would want to communicate the actual findings. Sometimes it's appropriate to do that in a writing, sometimes less so. And then how much detail do we want to have in that writing? And that's all going to be dictated by ultimately who the other constituencies are, right? So if you know that you're going to have, for example, a report out to regulators, that may change the level of detail that you would provide in a written report to the board when you concluded the work.
Okay, thank you. That was excellent. All right, I'm looking at the time. We're going to end in time, but we have a bunch of questions. So I'm going to ask one on behalf of Joan Amble, which she said at the outset, which is, what happens when someone you thought was a good actor has bad behavior? How do you deal with that? A good person who's made a bad choice.
So there are different types of bad choices. Some of them are intentional and fraudulent, and those people generally have to go. Lots of them are just mistakes, or they were playing too close to the line. If some people are salvageable, like we'll go through these investigations and ultimately determine that the business practice needs to be remediated. It may end up costing the company a lot of money, but on balance, I've certainly had situations where boards have decided that they wanted to keep those executives in place, even though they might have had some degree of lapse in judgment, or certainly made a decision that had a very negative operational impact on the company. What more typically happens is that there's less gray area. It's you might have a CEO that didn't get set out, or a CFO or whomever who didn't set out to engage in a fraudulent act, but was clearly working very, very hard to get as close to the line as they could. As opposed to, I relied on bad information, or I didn't dig into this as deeply as I should have. I defer to, business head X or something like that. If their risk appetite is fundamentally different than the risk appetite of the full board, then you're likely going to need to part ways with that individual. Likely not for cause. Likely you're going to have to pay them a lot of money when they leave, right? But that's generally how the boards that I've worked with have dealt with those circumstances.
Thank you. That's great guidance. Chris Manos.
Hi, thanks, Lisa. And this has been a really intriguing presentation. Thank you for that. And I just, before I ask my question, I have to say, when you asked about saying why, I think that follow-up is critical. And one of the comments I put on the chat, and I would just share with the group, is that having multiple women on boards, on a board, means that what I see is we follow up on each other's questions more. So instead of you having to shoulder the burden of asking all 5 questions, if suddenly Betsy and then suddenly Ruth Ann is asking the follow-up question, management participates and you're not seen as a nag, but you can really get to the root of an issue. So that was just my observation on yours. My question, though, is to me, the hardest part of board work is getting from the I smell something to the board, kind of reversing the traditional nose and fingers out and actually taking the action that's necessary to deal with the smoke. Yes. So any insights you have on that transition and how individual board members can move to board action would be appreciated.
Sure. Well, I come from the perspective of outside counsel, so understand that is going to color my answer to this. But frequently, we will get called in and what I would describe as a low-key inquiry, right? Because some board member or board members have a business concern or some other concern, and they don't want to they don't want to set the house on fire about it, but they want someone independent to take a look at it. So not independent of the company, right? Still representing the company, but someone who hasn't been involved in the issues. So that is one way to take an action that will ultimately arm you with the information to determine whether you need to act further. And the advantage of doing it with an outside lawyer as opposed to a consulting firm is that that's going to be a privileged review. And so that'll also give you some additional time to figure out, and the materials that are getting generated will be protected. And there's just a lot of advantages to doing it that way. But when we're doing purely internal investigations, meaning there's no law enforcement driving this, there's no regulator driving this, the company has self-identified a problem, a lot of the problems are not, they are being presented to us as, can you just sniff around and see if there's something that we need to be concerned about here? And a lot of the time the answer is no. And so then, the board feels some degree of comfort because they've discharged their duty, they looked at it. If the answer is yes, then we bring that information back to the board, and that enables the concerned board members to have actionable data. And then I've seen boards really act rather swiftly to address the concern. So that is one mechanism, and the one, obviously, from my perspective, I see most frequently.
Okay,
Thanks.
Maureen?
Hi. So I too am a former general counsel, and in that role, we had at the company I was at very, I thought, good reporting to the audit committee on any complaints that we would be getting. But there was a concern raised that we were not, through the whistleblowing and other mechanism, we're not getting any accounting whistleblowing complaints. And, we would pat ourselves on the back and think that's good news, like no news is good news. But there was concern in particular with the chair of the audit committee that why aren't we hearing more things, even if they wind up not leading to anything. And we tried to look at making sure, it was a global program, that things were being translated into local languages and that people were aware of, if you see something, say something. But it did a lot of head scratching. So I wondered whether you have any recommendations or anything that you would view as red flags in the situation that you're not getting complaints.
So Maureen, that is itself a red flag, right? So if you're getting complaints from all of these different units and you're not getting complaints from a particular unit, we've been called in just for that very purpose, right? So what would we do in that scenario? We would go behind that data. We would set up, scope out an internal review that would likely involve interviews, maybe some limited document review, looking at things like 360 reviews or just regular performance reviews of key leadership in the different geographies that would be relevant. So we sort of arm ourselves with that information, look at the trend data in the other groups. In that case, we look at the trend data in the other control groups with even a closer eye, and then deploy, right? Go see what we hear, come back. Maybe there's nothing. Maybe your audit team is doing a fantastic job. This is not a challenge. Or maybe you've got a culture within that unit where people don't feel comfortable reporting, and that happens. And so that's a big part of the work that we do. So not getting any complaints from a particular geography, business unit, or having the data on a sort of a per employee basis be out of line with your other data is something you want to pay close attention to. So that's a legitimate concern.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna get speedy here. Kathy Dyer.
I'll go fast. Thank you for this amazing information. I'd like to know if a board is going to initiate, have no history, but initiate periodic governance reviews. Do you recommend that the board look to existing law firms who work with the company, or do you recommend fresh eyes from a law firm that's not engaged with the company?
So the latter, but with the following caveat. You need to get somebody who plays well with others. You don't want to, you've got law firm A over here doing your governance. You don't want to get their arch enemy to come in and do the review. And because that's all that's going to happen is this firm is going to say terrible things about this firm and then try to get your governance work. That's the exact opposite of what you're looking for. So you would want someone, you'd want to bring in a firm that had good relationships generally with either the company or, or at least neutral relationships with the firm that is currently doing your governance work. But I would bring in a fresh set of eyes. And you can get this information. You start asking around. There are just some firms that play well with others and some that don't. And
Very
so
good.
that would be my suggestion.
Thank you.
All right, Joan Conley.
Thank you. I think you answered the question. It was about dashboards and what we should be spotting, but I think several of you mentioned ask why. So thank you for answering that. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I hope some really smart social scientist does a study about how board dynamics have changed since the introduction of PowerPoint, because I think it would be fascinating.
You too.
All right, so Susan, you have a question about minutes.
Yes. Oops, sorry, I'm trying to start my video. So I actually had, not in maybe such a bad situation that you're describing, but a kind of something recently that came up about this. So my question is, you talked earlier about, when there are issues where maybe people are probing a lot, maybe you don't know if there's something terribly wrong, but there could be, it's getting contentious. Maybe some people are saying, oh, that's how we've always done it. Other people want to ask more questions. What's your advice on how that gets minuted in board or board committee minutes? Because we don't want to write something that's kind of like a walking lawsuit waiting to happen. But on the other hand, not having any record is kind of also bad, and people may feel that their concerns or questions were overlooked. So that's, I'd be very interested to hear your view on that.
Right. So focus in minutes, of course, being around reflecting the deliberation. So there's a way to say, let's say you had, a 30-minute heated disagreement about this. You would minute that by saying, these individual board members asked questions. Hopefully they were answered. If they weren't answered, you say they were asked. Many were answered. There was a takeaway to get additional information. Here was the general topic about, about which the discussion took place. Here's how much time was covered, and then next steps. As opposed to what a lot of boards do, which is actually do minutes like they were a court reporter. You don't want to actually have the individual questions or the individual points of controversy. You want it to be clear enough what you talked about. And likely, if you're jumping off of board materials, there's a way to characterize that is essentially neutral, but will get you back to the subject matter. Should you later have to defend the deliberations that you made. But that's how I would minute that. I obviously defer to my governance specialists in the law, but we do a lot of that work just to reflect that there was the discussion, who participated, and critically, how long and what were the subjects, and leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. So last question is going to be Marla, who I think has a question to sum it all up. Go ahead, Marla.
Yeah, so thanks, Lisa. So to sum it all up, I'm curious as to, in your particular practice, what are the 3 or 4 things that you've seen over the past several years, which we should walk away with knowing, but for the grace of God, go we?
Almost every problem.
Yeah, but what are the most prevalent ones? Which are the ones that you see most prevalently that we can walk away saying, if we remember nothing else from today's discussion, these are the 3 or 4 things that we should be on the look for?
Dictatorial culture at the executive management level and at the board level. Sort of authoritarian rather than collaborative work processes. And all of the other problems stem from that, right? So, because if you have that collaboration and dialogue, the problems bubble up, they're dealt with in the normal course. Somebody might get fired, they might not, who cares? You've got your regular operations. If you've got a top-down, what is frequently sort of male patriarchal culture at either of those levels, board or executive management, it is a breeding ground for other problems. And all of the problems, the fraud, the culture, the sexual misconduct, just down the way. If your CEO, this is part and parcel of that, can't accept constructive criticism, then you are not likely getting the information that you need, right? Anybody who's super sensitive to constructive criticism is not going to give you in the board deck the information that you need. So these are just commonalities to all of the problems, as opposed to, this is the subject matter. Is that what you're looking for?
That's excellent. That's great, because it gives us the umbrella, and it all starts with the CEO and the relationship the CEO has with the board and the CEO has with others in the C-suite.
Right, and I don't mean to suggest that all of these folks have been men, right? Like that patriarchal authoritarian model can be executed by women, right? They've adopted this model because that's been beneficial to them over a period of their career. But it's that dynamic that sort of breeds problems.
So with that, and in the interest of not keeping everyone too late for their next Zoom, Valecia, thank you so much. This was fantastic. And I think we're all even wider awake after this. We will follow up. I'll send the replay. I think people will want to watch it twice. I'll send your contact information. I think people will want to reach out. And Susie, thank you so much as well for introducing Valecia to our group. Welcome to Ewob, Valecia. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy to come back whenever. So thanks, ladies. And thanks for doing what you do. We need more women on boards.
Thank you. All right. Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.